I have no gavel, so this meeting will come to order. This is a meeting of the Land Use Committee for Wednesday, August 28th, 2019. The item on our agenda is the petition for, is it 1800 North Walnut? The Motel 6 site. I understand that we have a 10-minute presentation from Mr. Grulich and then several short presentations from other city staff, department heads. With that, I'll start with Mr. Grulich and he can introduce them. Or is your presentation first?
I think our director wants to
Okay, we'll
speak
start
first.
with Terry Porter, the Director of Planning and Transportation. Ms. Porter, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just wanted to take a few minutes, well, hopefully even less than that, just to address a couple things that were said at the August 7th hearing here about this project that I take issue with, and I wanted to bring this to your attention and do so with as much respect and deference. Councilmember Piedmont Smith, you mentioned that you did not equate the payment in lieu with
Ms.
a
Porter,
public
let me just
benefit.
point out that it's appropriate to address the chair and not any particular member. Yeah, please go ahead. You can discuss her comments, but not
So-
directly to her, yeah.
Councilmember Piedmont Smith stated in the meeting that the payment in lieu that was being offered by Collegiate Development Group does not equate to a public benefit, and I strongly disagree with that statement. It most certainly does. At the moment, the funds that have gone into the Affordable Housing Fund are, there's 103 units that are under construction right now. Mecca Development on Crescent Road, Bloomington Cooperative Living, that's another 20 units. SIHO, South Central Indiana Housing Organization, has been funded for 8 units. It's 131 units of affordable housing that is currently under construction and approved, and it's because of this private money that has assisted with the pro formas for these projects. Affordable housing is very expensive. If it wasn't, more developers would do it. It needs a lot of subsidy, and this most definitely is a public benefit. The second thing I wanted to take issue with was also from Councilmember Piedmont Smith, the term pay to play, and that was equated with this donation from Collegiate Development Group. This infers that Planning and Transportation, the department, my department of the city, would approve a project only because developers voluntarily agreed to contribute money to that fund for the development of more affordable housing. Approving a project just because of a donation, that would violate the code of ethics that we are sworn to with our AICP certifications. We could risk losing our professional certification to engage in unethical behavior. And I find the term offensive, and it appears to call into question the ethics of an entire department to infer that we would approve a project only because of the funding. And then to have a, well, for a better term, to use the pay to play is really, it's a NIMBY term. And Mr. Furr said the same thing when he spoke against the project, and he's not a neighbor, he's a competitor. Why would he want this project? And also said that the only reason planning approved it was because of the funding. And I'm just stating publicly and to you that we find this term offensive and would like the use of it to stop.
At this point, I'd like to break in and say that although I think we're very interested in what you have to say, that we may have put the cart before the horse. We should get the briefest presentation about what the project is and what's changed, and then get into some of the, I think other department heads are here to comment on similar things. So I would ask kindly that Mr. Grulich present, unless you have more to say, because we'd like to, I think, address, I mean, that way after everyone is presented, then we can ask questions of the presenters. So with that, before we have the other department heads speak, could we have Mr. Grulich present?
Yes. Thank you very much.
I will give you a chance to address those comments, but they're a bit premature. Mr. Grulich, please set the stage for us, what it is we're talking about.
Thank you. This is a request from CDG Acquisitions to rezone a piece of property that is at 1800 North Walnut Street. The property is currently zoned commercial arterial, has been developed with a motel development, and the petitioners are requesting to rezone this to a planned unit development in order to allow for the site to be redeveloped with a student-oriented housing development. Surrounding land uses include several high-density multifamily projects to the north, east, and south. To the west, you've got Miller Showers Park, as well as some high-density multifamily on the west side as well. So the petitioners are requesting this rezoning in order to allow for the property to be redeveloped. There is a required 5-acre minimum for a PUD that the petitioners are also seeking a waiver for. This site has been designed to provide student-oriented housing in compliance or furthering the goals of the comprehensive plan. So the comprehensive plan encouraged the city to look for areas outside of the downtown to locate student-oriented housing, and this area has been highlighted as one of those areas that is ideal for this type of land use. As I mentioned, it is surrounded by student-oriented housing now and high density in nature. It is bounded to the north by the bypass, to the south by Dunn Street, to the east of Dunn Street, to the south by 17th, and west along College and Walnut. There is a grocery store immediately to the northwest corner of the area. The area, when I refer to that, is this quadrant, this particular area with the bypass, 17th, Dunn, in the College area. So this is along the Bloomington Transit route. The IU Stadium is just to the east of this, where the Park and Ride is located for the shuttle service. It's on a Bloomington Transit route, as I mentioned. You've got a grocery store. It's on arterial roads, stoplight intersections at all 4 corners surrounding this area. So this is an area that's been highlighted that would be ideal for student-oriented housing. So the petitioner has come forward with a proposal following that that is also in keeping with the proposed design standards that are in the new Unified Development Ordinance. So the petitioners have come forward with a project density, height, setbacks, impervious surface that is in keeping with what we want to see in a location that we feel that is appropriate for that. So they are proposing buildings that are 5 to 6 stories in height, could have a possible total of 270 units and 820 bedrooms. These would be a mix of micro units, 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, and 4-bedroom units. There would be a parking garage constructed on the site as well. Approved minimum parking ratio is proposed at a minimum of 0.5 spaces per bedroom at a maximum of 0.75 spaces per bedroom. With this petition, they will have a significant amount of bicycle parking. At the Plan Commission hearings, they committed to providing several off-site improvements to complete a sidewalk system in this particular area. As I mentioned, this was heard at the council at the August 7th hearing. There were several comments that were expressed by the Land Use Committee that they would like to see changed, additional information submitted for today's hearing. So the petitioners have been working on addressing some of those comments, and I'll just kind of go through those briefly. The commercial space along the front was revised for its location, as well as the proposed driveway and parking spaces that are along the front were removed. This allowed for the building to be located closer to the street, and the petitioners have incorporated a plaza area to help promote and improve the building interaction between this and the street. They've also facilitated further communication with Varsity Villas to the east to help accomplish a pedestrian connection through that site to help get people closer to the Bloomington or the IU bus stop. The building setback to the south has been increased to address the concerns of the adjacent property owner. and the modulation has increased along the front as well. I believe the petitioner will probably go into a little bit more detail about some of those changes, but I just wanted to highlight the big picture with that. So this is the site plan that has been revised since the last hearing. You can see that the driveway and parking spaces have been removed. The gray shaded areas represent plaza and sidewalk area along the front. There would be raised landscape planter beds as well. I'll just kind of step through the site plan. You can see those plaza areas and seating a little bit better. There will be 4 areas of outdoor seating and plaza space. 2 sidewalk connections were installed to help connect this to the building, from the building to the street. There is a water line and easement that runs along a good portion of the front that prevents the building from going even further to the front, as well as this front area is also needed for a little bit of storm water detention area. So the petitioners have moved the building as close to the street as they can, given some of these constraints. As I mentioned, they did increase the setback to the south property line. There was an adjacent property owner that spoke about their concerns with the proximity to the building to their property. So they've increased they've narrowed up the building, increased that setback from 13 to 15 feet to help address those concerns as well. They've also submitted some new renderings showing how this plaza space would look. So this is a rendering looking southeast from the north side of the site. You can see the sidewalk connections. The commercial space is still along the front, but they have changed the look of that a little bit. The building has popped out a little bit as well, so they've increased the modulation with this kind of tower component that's framed by some of the brick that's surrounding that. So this is a view looking northeast. Again, you can see the main entrance drive on the bottom of the screen, the plaza space along the front, and how that interacts with the street. This is another rendering kind of from the south again, so you can see the plaza space and then the driveway that circles around the south side of the building. Some of the modulation has increased along the front, as I mentioned, a little bit more diversity in what they're proposing. So this is just a brief rendering. The petitioner has a couple other slides that have better renderings for this site relative to the existing surroundings. This is looking south along College Avenue. The Hampton Inn building is just on the left side of the screen, and in the background you can see the proposed building. And in the kind of the front of that is the Great Wall Restaurant, a single-story commercial building that's currently vacant on the site. So with that, the petitioner has tried to address a lot of the concerns that were raised by the Land Use Committee. They made a lot of changes along the front, increased the setback. The massing of the building has more or less stayed the same. It's a 6-story building, 5 stories along the front with taller sections in the back. So with that, I will turn it over to the petitioner if they would like to add anything. Or leave that up to the Land Use Council if they would like to hear from staff at this time. I've just real briefly kind
It's
of
fine to have the
reiterate.
petitioner, speak.
Okay. Yep, I'll turn that over to the petitioner.
Mitch Cordy with Collegiate Development Group. Thank you, Eric. Appreciate the overview. So I'll keep my part of the presentation very brief tonight so I can bring our architect up and he can go into a little more detail about the design. You guys gave us some very insightful comments in the first meeting, and we're excited to show you how we've incorporated that into the revised design. So we just gave a quick list here of some of the main concerns that were brought up: front setback, side setback, visibility with the retail. We provided some additional views that you guys are looking for. And then we've also worked to finalize the transit route with Bloomington Transit. And Lou May has actually been kind enough to be here as well if there are any questions specifically related to that. So with that being said, I'll turn it over to Imran.
Thank you, Mitch. Thank you, Eric. Good evening, Council. My name is Imran Kifayat. I am with Dwell Design Studio. We're the architects for this project. Have been working with Collegiate Development Group, to bring it to this point. I'm sorry I missed the last hearing, which occurred a few weeks ago, but we did discuss all of the comments that you provided in detail. We've gone to great efforts to try to incorporate your comments and your recommendations into the design, and hope that you guys find that the changes that we've made are moving the project in a positive direction. We can start with this view. As Eric had mentioned previously, we have reworked the front of the building along Walnut, and the idea was really to remove the parking. I mean, although I felt like a little bit of teaser parking along Walnut would have been good for the success of the retail space, I think the resulting space is actually really quite nice. I understand that there's a larger goal to turn this project as one stop along the way of a pedestrian corridor along Walnut. I think to that end, the kind of spaces that we're creating in front of the building could actually, feature as a bit of a node and its expansion area where, pedestrians could stop, take a little break, find some shade, and maybe even grab a bite to eat. So I think this view captures pretty nicely the kind of space that we think could result from some of these changes. Eric, could we go to the next slide, please? This is, obviously, this is the previous view. This is kind of what we're used to, we're kind of used to seeing this, a little bit of parking, just to kind of control the speed of cars as they're moving through the development. And it does lend a, sort of a positive sort of air of, retail and commercial space on the ground floor. But we understand that the decision to move to a more pedestrian environment in front of the building is probably a step in the right direction, especially given the long-term goals for creating a little bit of a pedestrian node. So if we could go to the next slide, please. This more or less kind of, I think, communicates what we think could become of this space. It's really the ability for some of the commercial activities, and that includes some of the amenity spaces that are being located on the ground floor as well for the residential uses, for them to create a little bit of a transition from interior conditioned spaces into outdoor open air spaces. We feel like that permeability is good for pedestrian interaction. I think should result in really quite a bit of ground level activity, if you will, in front of this project. We think that's a benefit to this neighborhood.
Pardon me, what angle is that?
This is looking from the north towards the southeast.
Looking
of
towards the
site.
southeast? Okay,
Yes,
thank
that's
you.
correct. We're probably at the median between Walnut and College as we're looking at this view, sort of looking diagonally towards the southeast of the site. So this is also one of the new images that we've created. This is at Walnut, just south of the driveway coming into our site. To the right-hand side in the foreground is a neighboring property just to the south of our site. So the parking that we're seeing to the right-hand side and in the foreground is really not being proposed on our project. It's sort of what's existing on the site just south of us.
Say that last sentence again.
The parking that's being shown, the information that's being shown in the foreground and just to the right of this image, this is actually our neighboring property just to the south of our site, just for context. Exactly. I think what we wanted to communicate with this perspective was the quality of architecture. I think that there was also a comment about the types of materials that are being proposed along the Walnut frontage. Would any of that continue and in what manner, towards the east? So this is really more of an exposure of the south facade. And what we're trying to show is that same level of articulation and architectural vocabulary that's being used along Walnut is meant to extend eastward into the site. I mean, when we looked at the site early on, we felt like there really was no sort of rear of this project. We felt like all four sides were critical and kind of presented a front face for the project. So I think this is meant to communicate that the building in the foreground has a slightly different language than the building that's in the background. This is the building to the east that's in the background. But we're trying to use the same high-quality materials throughout. And they consist of panels with a reveal system for more contemporary look, a fairly high-end, dark gray brick. And we're using, in a limited fashion, we're using some color for accent. I don't think we've exactly nailed down what that color will be, but we feel like some of the neutral tones that are being proposed for the project, some of that can be broken up with some level of accent, either as highlights and reveals, or in select areas as shading devices, as you might see around the window openings. This is a view from College, headed south with our project on the left-hand side. We are just north of the Hampton Inn project, which is north of our project, but for context, we wanted to show, how this project reveals itself as we're headed into the city of Bloomington. I think also I think both this image and the following image communicate what we're trying to do to prevent this building from being a monolithic mass and to break it up both using materials and massing to create a level of interest, and then also to have light and shadow play across the building's design. This is a view from the south. Again, I believe we're on College, looking north. Our project is just sort of behind the trees in the median. I believe this was a view that was requested by the city. We have overlaid our design, our project in an aerial that was sent to us. I think what we're trying to do, and I think this was always our intention, was to have a building that we understand that the massing and the scale is different from what exists on the site right now, but the idea was that the architecture really should blend into the language of the surrounding context. So again, using neutral tones, having masses that aren't monolithic or occupying entire city blocks. The intent was to create smaller pieces that function in a way where it sort of ameliorates with the overall site design. These views are probably more architectural studies. They're colored massing perspectives. This is what we use internally to try to figure out how materials are being used throughout the site. This is a view more or less at the southwest corner, looking across the entire southern facade of the project. And again, we wanted to show this to you to communicate the types of materials that are being used and the level of architecture that's being employed to create this design. We're trying to create breaks. We're trying to highlight some of those breaks using darker materials, amidst larger, lighter colored panels. We've also created a break between the two building masses. We felt like, given the size of the site, obviously we've covered this before, but it made sense to accent the fact that there are actually two building components rather than one continuous building along the south facade. This view captures, the view from the southwest corner, again, sort of looking diagonally. We're looking right at our leasing office, our primary sort of residential corner of the project. To the left of that is a proposed pedestrian plaza that we're proposing along Walnut. And it does show the building as it climbs grade towards the east and how we're using massing to reconcile some of the issues with grading on the site. This is a view from the northwest corner. This is the opposite corner. This is the retail commercial corner of the project. And again, what may be visible, and I believe we have another slide that communicates this, is along the northern facade, we have a couple of outward-facing courtyards. So we actually have a lot of depth that we tried to introduce into the project. And again, the idea was to not present a monolithic mass, but really to create a series of outdoor spaces that are more or less defined by the wings of the building, to limit the amount of mass that's actually exposed along the northern facade. This is a better view that shows what the resulting courtyards look like along the north facade. Again, we expect quite a bit of pedestrian activity. These are contemplative. These are quiet courtyards. These aren't meant to be loud or kinetic spaces. So I think what we expect to see are folks relaxing, reading a book, and a lot of just sort of foot traffic, a lot of pedestrian activity, not just around the perimeter of our site, but actually how it's introduced into our project. Some architectural elevations. These are just the head-on views of all four sides. The first slide shows the south facade and the east facade. The following slide shows the north and the west facades. The key along the top just communicates the materials that are being used. Primarily, we're using a couple of different tones of brick. We're using cementitious panels, fiber cement panels. They're being assembled using architectural reveals. As I mentioned earlier, for a more contemporary look, we are using, to break up some of this and to soften it a little bit, we are using some materials that will have a wood tone finish to it as well. And we'll use that selectively, primarily as a way to kind of warm, to add a little bit of warmth to areas where we're introducing the more charcoal gray brick. As I mentioned, some of the other facades that are being proposed. And then finally, I understand that CDG has been working with the city for a proposed a bus route. The project could function as one of the nodes in this circulation pattern. My understanding is that this is being actively discussed and is subject to evolve and, would be probably tweaked a little bit as it moves forward, but I think this was meant to be shared as just sort of the direction that circulation pattern is going. I believe that's the last slide. Available to answer any questions if you have any.
Thank you. I want to ask my colleagues here, would we rather finish hearing presentations from department heads, or should we start asking questions now?
Finish presentations.
Well, I understand that Ms. Sims from Housing and Neighborhood Development is here, Mr. Crowley from Economic and Sustainable Development is here, and Mr. May to talk about the transit line. So what's your pleasure? If I don't have any objection, I'll just finish having department heads present, and then we'll go to questions. Mr. Crowley?
Hi, Alex Crowley, Director of Economic and Sustainable Development for the city. Thanks for spending the time to review the project. Let me start by saying I agree with the basic premise of the Land Use Committee resolution that says predictability in the development process is desired by petitioners. I also agree that the public wants and deserves a say in what happens in the built environment. So I think all of that is right. I know that predictability and transparency are especially important to people making significant investments in our community, whether major developers like this, or new businesses, or people even choosing to move here. Remembering that all of these people, whoever they are taking financial risks to invest in Bloomington. And in this case, at a time when there's a fair amount of uncertainty in the economy. So I hope you'll agree that we want developers and businesses and individuals to make the right kinds of investments in Bloomington, and when they propose to do so, in alignment with the comp plan and other community guidance, that we should make that investment as easy and successful as possible. So with this in mind, I urge you to recognize staff's recommendation of approval and the Plan Commission's unanimous recommendation of approval for the following reasons. The developer has reacted very positively and constructively to our requirements. They've been good partners throughout, and I expect that to continue. They've made adjustments to the site plan as requested not only by staff and Plan Commission, but also this committee. They're proposing to contribute significantly to the Housing Development Fund to help us stimulate affordability in the community. And remember, this is a private sector contribution to the fund, which augments public monies. Public money alone cannot solve our affordability issue. And if you recall from previous discussions, we're able to leverage the Housing Development Fund and other local incentives many-fold to bring outside capital in to help us with the affordability issue that we have. But even at a basic level, the development is bringing much-needed housing stock to our market, which will help us keep pace with the growth in population. And as you know, there's a basic supply and demand problem in Bloomington, and basic economics tell us that more supply will inevitably lower rental rates over time. The location of the development aligns with the basic guidance of the comprehensive plan, and this replaces a land use that is suboptimal, and this development will create incremental tax resources that will help Bloomington maintain and grow its quality of life investments. In sum, we're all working together on a number of fronts to address affordability and the basic supply issue in Bloomington. We have the opportunity today to bring more supply in the right location. Let's take that opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Sims?
I always have to adjust the mic. So good evening. I'm Doris Sims. I'm the Director of Housing and Neighborhood Development Department, and I'm here asking your support for this project. I'm not here to speak about the merits of the project design. That has already been done through the Planning Department as well through the Plan Commission as they've moved this forward to the Council for their consideration. But I am here to talk to you about the contribution that the developer has committed to our Housing Development Fund. As you know, in 2016, the City Council, part of that body, created the Affordable Housing Fund. That fund was created by a contribution of $1 million from a housing developer. As stated by Ms. Porter, to date, there has been 131 affordable units that have been created utilizing money out of the Housing Development Fund. In addition, we just recently approved for the Bloomington Housing Authority funding out of the Housing Development Fund to preserve 106 public housing units. As you know, our local housing authority is going through a major renovation to upgrade those units that have not been really upgraded since that housing authority has been built over 50 years ago. And so they're going through that, and we'll be helping them by utilizing funding out of the Housing Development Fund. Last week during my budget presentation, one of the questions that was asked to me, because my department administers the Federal Community Development Block Grant as well as home funds, which uses to build affordable housing, is that funding shrinking? And my response is yes. Federal dollars are shrinking, state dollars are shrinking, and now it's come to us as a local body that we need to contribute to if we want more affordable housing within the Bloomington community. I also one of the things that we look at when we talk to developer is, if there's possibility of putting affordable housing units on site within the development or nearby. And sometimes that's not really realistic, especially if the development is more catered towards student housing. As a young family, I don't think that they would want to live in an apartment building where it's a very high rise if you have young kids, as well as if there's a lot of partying going on. So a contribution to the Housing Development Fund helps us to be able to build housing that's catered towards the low-income families here within our community. So again, I ask your support of this project. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. May, can you tell us a little bit about the proposed line, transit line? Can we get to that slide? Yeah.
Lou May, General Manager, Bloomington Public Transportation Corporation. Let me say that we've been in discussions with the developer recently about transportation linkages between the proposed site and the university campus there. And we've kicked around several different routing alternatives with them. This is one that they've proposed. So we continue in discussions. They are very interested in funding a general public route. And I want to stress that this would not be an exclusive route just for the residents of the complex, but it would be a general public route that would connect this area where the new development is proposed with the area of campus there. The route that they're showing there is a route that loops around the campus, including service to 10th Street and 3rd Street there. We've also kicked around some other routing options as well. So again, in our proposal to them, we've given them cost estimates based on the routing alignment and service frequencies. Ideally, we'd like to see at least a 30-minute frequency of service there. We'd fund it, we'd operate it with a full-size Bloomington Transit bus. We anticipate it'll be a very popular route with students, given the need for a transportation linkage from the site to the campus there. And so the conversations have been good, but they've been positive with the developer so far, and we're confident that they'll continue on track to fund this transportation linkage to campus.
Thanks very much. All right, I'm going to open it up to questions from council members, from members of the committee, with the caution that we have a 7:15 deadline. I want to reserve the final 15 minutes for council member debate, and we have yet to get to public comment. So I would hope that we will, I know that there's been a long presentation for a second meeting, but I would ask us to try to ask only the most important questions here tonight. Do I have questions from colleagues? Mr. Sturbaum.
Yeah, maybe this is for the architect, but what percentage of the skin of the building is cementitious panels?
So to be honest, we have not done the material takeoffs. My guess is the fiber cement panels probably constitute 60 to probably 75% of the facades.
It even looks like more than that to me. I'm trying to figure out what's brick, and it seems to be a very small accent of brick,
Well,
and primarily these cement panels.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Yeah, for example, in this perspective, anything that's being shown along the ground floor would be masonry material. And then anything that's being shown in a gray tone would also be a masonry material. And again, I'm happy to go back and actually verify what those numbers are, but just off the top of
Well,
our head.
that's close enough.
Yeah,
What's the span of that material?
of fiber
Is there-
cement.
Yeah,
Of the fiber cement material. So we have seen it in projects now that have been around for 20 to 25 years, and it holds up quite well. It does need to be maintained. It needs to be painted usually after about 15 years. Initially, when this product came out, some of the earliest installations, not to get too technical, but they were installed directly over a substrate, and so they caused a little bit of delamination and some warping. What's being done now is, first of all, the industry sort of expanded, so now there are different qualities of materials that are available. That's improved the lifespan because it's just become a more competitive marketplace. And secondly, the material is now not directly installed over a substrate. Usually it's now held off using either purlins or some sort of a rain screen. So that essentially it receives ventilation not just on the exposed facade, the exposed face, but also behind the material as well. So my personal guess is that the material, if well maintained and not damaged and refinished, installed correctly, there's no reason to assume that it couldn't last 30 years or more.
And this is more of a business question, but the business practice of the development of these projects, and maybe this project in particular, some groups hold them and some groups build them and sell them as soon as they can to insurance companies and
Sure.
what have you. I'm interested in that model. What is the business model? And I guess associated with this is the ongoing commitment to transit. Is there supervision on the site? What's the assurance that there's long-term support for this kind of building?
I'm going to have to defer to the owner on this. It's my understanding that they intend to, keep the property, but I'll defer to them.
Okay.
Hi, Tim Van Mater with Collegiate Development Group. So we've developed 7, 8 properties across the country, and all of our partners on our projects are institutional equity partners, and again, there's no prescribed amount of hold period for any REIT or institutional equity partner, but to date, we've only sold one project, and that goes back to 2015. So on average, I would say it's at least 3 years after the building stabilized and occupied that we hold the real estate. And then from a management perspective, there will most definitely be on-site management. Typically, there will be a property manager, a leasing manager, and then there will be 2 to 3 maintenance techs, as well as resident assistants that will actually have units on site that will also be working with the management company throughout.
Okay.
Can we move on to another?
Yeah, let's go on, please.
All right,
Somebody else.
Councilmember Chopra?
Question for the developer about the parking ratio, the beds to parking ratio. You quoted the parking ratio as anywhere between 0.5 and I think 0.75. Why is there a range there?
So right now, we're at right around 0.5%, or I guess 0.5 per bed, and I think that's where we're starting. As the design evolves, it may fluctuate just a little bit. We're still, somewhat early on, but I think we feel very comfortable at the 50% mark. Just talking, I think in the last meeting, we talked a little bit about surveying other properties and what parking spaces are out there still, and we feel like 50% is where we need to be.
Okay, it seems like that's a pretty big range. So I wonder if you'd be able to get that narrowed down should this proposal go forward to council.
Sure, I think there's some room that we can probably skinny it up a little bit. Yep.
Okay. Thank you. And my second question is for Mr. Grulich. We've got a UDO that's a draft. It's a draft. It's a draft. I'm saying that like 3 times. But let's just say we compared this proposal to what is being proposed in the draft UDO. How does it fit or not fit?
This fits almost exactly what the new UDO is calling out for. So the new UDO for the student housing district calls out for a maximum 6-story buildings with a maximum 75 feet of height, 15-foot setbacks, 70% maximum impervious surface coverage, no density cap that is being proposed. So this project is very much in line with how the new UDO is being written to address this type of housing.
Excellent, thank you.
Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Isn't the proposal 85 feet height? Isn't the height proposal 85
So
feet?
the proposal for this is 85 feet, and the new UDO calls out for 75 feet. One difference that I would point out to this is the 85 feet, currently the way that the height is measured in the UDO is from the lowest point on the site to the highest part of the building. So in the new UDO, we are proposing to change that to reflect more of the average grade that happens on a site. So that number would probably come down a little bit closer to the 75 feet once you factor out the average grade on the site.
I want to ask about the setback requirements that would be required if this PUD were not approved. We received some correspondence from legal counsel for neighbors that is very concerned about the setbacks. Could you speak to that? I assume that Mr. Founds also has contacted you about their concerns.
Yep, so based on the current zoning of the property, so the property is zoned commercial arterial. So the commercial arterial, your side yard building setback is 7 feet. So your side and rear setback is 7 feet regardless of the number of stories. The maximum height is 50 feet. So this proposal, they've got 13 to 15 feet along the south and then a greater distance along the north and the east. So this does vary from the underlying zoning district, of course, but you know, with the PUD, they are proposing new standards that are more in keeping with what this type of development is.
So in addition to setbacks, I believe our UDO currently requires side yard distance. Is that in addition to the 7 feet, or?
No, so the 7 feet in this particular instance, because it's not adjacent to any residential districts, it's just a straight 7-foot setback for the building.
But it may not be adjacent to any residential districts, but it is adjacent, or at least catty corner, like the far east side is very close to another set of condos.
Yep, so the buffer yard is only based on district, not on the use. So if this was adjacent to an RS or an RC district or an RM, then there would be a buffer yard requirement, but everything that is around here, well, so this is CA up against RH, so there's no buffer that is required from those two districts.
So I'm sorry, what is the zoning district that the neighboring property is on?
Let me pull up the map for you.
This is CA, right? Commercial arterial.
Yep, so the properties all to the east, so on the right side of the screen is what you can see as a zoning map. So the line that kind of follows through here and then circles around here, this is the CA, so everything over here is zoned CA. To the east of this, everything over here is zoned RH. So there is not an additional setback that is required from the CA versus the RH.
So RH does not have any buffer yard requirements.
I'm going to triple verify that. Oh, no, I'm sorry. No, there is a type 2 that is required, so there would be an additional 15 feet in addition to the 7. So it'd be 22 along that little corner where the CA is against the RH. I apologize for that.
So, but the proposal is only 7 feet.
So
On all sides?
So the proposal, what they're proposing along the south is a range of 13 to 15 feet. They've got a little bit more, 24 feet, 25 feet to the north. And then to the east, the setback that they're proposing, I think, is a little bit closer to 20. So while it doesn't
I thought you
meet-
said 7 feet. What was the 7 feet?
So the 7
referring to?
feet is the base setback for the building for the CA district. So in the CA district, Side yard, rear yard building setback is 7 feet from your side and rear property lines, regardless of the height. So because this does have RH along one corner, there is a buffer yard requirement that kicks in an additional 15-foot setback on top of that 7. So 22 feet would be what would be required.
And that is actually existing in the plan only on the north side?
I'm sorry?
So 22 feet would be required.
Yes. For the portions of this site where the CA is up against the RH.
Right.
Yes.
And so is that requirement met?
With this petition, no. They are requesting a PUD to allow a deviation from that.
How much of a deviation again?
So 22 is required, 15 to 13 is being proposed.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions. Start with Mr. May. I have some questions about the bus line, namely, first of all, would it run all year? If not, how long would it run in a calendar? Where would the bus stop? In front of the building or somewhere else?
The bus stop would be on North Walnut Street, and in our discussions with the developer, they're amenable to providing a shelter for the bus stop there.
Would there be a carve-out for the bus, or would the bus stop traffic?
I believe it would be right on the street, so of course it's a 2-lane northbound street there, so traffic could get around the bus.
Okay. And how long would it run in the calendar year?
The initial proposal that we've given them would be the entire calendar year. We have had some discussions about possibly limiting it just to the spring and the fall semesters.
Or perhaps a longer time between buses in the summer?
Anything is possible. Basically, it depends on, obviously, the cost of the service will be higher the longer that it runs during the course of the year there, and it'll be lower if it's just running during the semesters.
For how long are they proposing to fund the bus?
For how long?
How many years?
No discussion on the terms of the length of the contract with them.
What's that? Yeah. Last question about the bus. Well, actually, I've forgotten it. I'll turn that question to the developer. For how long did you intend to fund the bus that Mr. May has just talked about?
So just real quick, I'll point out there was a condition of approval with the Plan Commission that required this petition to coordinate with Bloomington Transit for shuttle service. So
So it's indefinite?
yes.
Okay.
But wait, that is, sorry.
No, I'll defer to Councilmember Puyon-Smith for a follow-up.
That's rather vague to say that they will coordinate with Bloomington Transit for a shuttle service. That does not mean they will pay for it. That does not mean it'll run every half hour. That does not mean it'll run 12 months a year. So those are the kind of details I was hoping that the petitioner could clarify for us.
So let me just clarify a little bit. In our report, it stated that they were not allowed to use their own shuttle service and that they had to coordinate with Bloomington Transit for shuttle service for this site.
Yes, I understand that.
Okay.
But do you understand what I mean? It doesn't really pin down the details.
No, it does not pin down the details other than they are not allowed to operate their own shuttle.
Gotcha. Petitioner, is there anybody who can speak to this?
We don't have specifics right now as to, the timeframes that Mr. May spoke to about whether it would run the same timeframes in the summer months as it does in the spring or the fall. If there's things that you guys are requesting, or we can take that back to our discussions with Mr. May, but this is obviously kind of a new conversation from the last committee meeting we had, and so we're working through the details. As far as longevity of funding, I think, if Bloomington Transit's not willing to provide that route without a contribution from us, and we're required by the Planning Commission approval to coordinate and provide a transit stop, and it can't be a private stop, then I think that answers the question. We would have to come to the table to figure out how we can get Bloomington Transit and ourselves to come to an agreement.
While you're up there, that leads me to the question, what do you expect your non-school year occupancy to be in this unit
That's
project?
hard to say. Every market's a little bit different, and sometimes from year to year it changes significantly, and depending on what your tenant base looks like, whether they're athletes or non-athletes, it just kind of all depends. But on average, I could say that it's about a 50% carry through the summer.
So
And
there's a
that-
reason for this bus to run in the summer from your project as well?
Yes, there would be benefit to it. Now, obviously, they don't have the same types of schedules that they do during the fall and spring semesters, so we would, have to figure out what made sense, but a reduced shuttle time frame would be
Okay.
legitimate.
Next question while you're up there. Do you believe that projecting signage would make a difference in the viability of your commercial
Projecting
space?
signage? Meaning
Signs
like a
that stick out
blade?
more than a foot from the edge of the building?
To be honest with you, it could, but, I mean, obviously, commercial tenants like signage, but really it's location-based and parking-based is really the two critical factors for them. Could that be an added benefit if they were able to produce a, standoff signage? Sure.
Okay.
I guess I'm not familiar with, is there a restriction that's not allowed?
There is a restriction. Projecting signs are not a part of code now. That's fine. You've answered my question. I appreciate it.
Okay.
My last question is for Mr. Crowley and Ms. Sims. Both of you have described, this as sort of a student, not just you, Mr. Grulich, as well. The phrase student housing has come up, that this area is soon to be designated student housing. It is, as I have said multiple times, an appellation that I do not like. But the idea, one of the aspects of this project is that there would be 160-some units. The majority of units, the majority of beds in this project are in 4-bedroom units. These are the kinds of units, these and 5-bedroom units are the ones that generate nuisance calls. They're the ones where the parties happen. If we were so concerned about parties happening in so-called student housing, why would the city be endorsing a project that has so many so many of these units that we wouldn't want to build affordable housing on site because of the partying? What do you say to that, either of you? Do you understand what I'm asking?
I can tell you, Councilmember Volan, that what I said was that if you are a family with small children, you would not want to live in an apartment building where there tends to be a lot of younger college students who may tend to party. So does that address your question?
I think it does.
Thank you.
Mr. Crowley, I'm trying to find my question here, and
I can also, if I can add a little something.
if you can add to that,
Yeah.
I would appreciate that.
I think the value, my son just started college, and he's, it's just cheaper to have more roommates. The smaller the bedroom count, the more expensive a unit is, right? The more beds there are in a unit, the cheaper per bed you're gonna see that amount. And so, at least that's the experience he's having, and I suspect that would be the case here, if I'm not mistaken. So I think, you balance it out. You want to have the ability for people to afford to live in a place like this. I think that comes with having more roommates sometimes, and so that's, I think, why we're reasonably comfortable with having, 4-bedroom as well as other unit counts.
Thank you. I'll turn it to the developer. Can we get a basic price? How much difference is there per bed in a 1-bedroom versus a 4? How much money are people saving, according to Mr. Crowley?
There's about a $200 difference per bedroom between a 1 and a 4-bedroom.
So what's a 1-bedroom rental typical?
So our 1-bedrooms are just under about $1,000, and our 4-bedrooms are right around $800.
Okay, thank you. Are there any second round questions? They should be brief because we need to get to public comment. Mr. Serban.
Yes. Could you also estimate the utilities that go along with that cost and the relative efficiency of this structure?
Relative efficiency of
Like, it isn't a LEED building, but what sustainable practices are going into this project?
Yeah, I think as part of our PUD submission, we had a pretty exhaustive list of the sustainable features that we were incorporating into the design, and that's ever evolving and growing as we find, as the design evolves. I think, the architect can speak to that you're always looking and finding ways to include sustainable elements, whether it's sunshades or other elements that you can't just, say what kind of fixtures you're going to pick or what kind of skin materials you're going to use. It's kind of an ever-evolving process. From a utility perspective, was your question more about what the cost to the residents would be?
Yes.
Typically included in our rent is cable and internet is already included, and water and sewer are included, and trash. So they would be paying for electric, and on average is $25 to $35 a month per resident.
That's the heat and cool?
Correct. And yeah, to heat hot water as well.
And it does work out to be $25 a month?
For each resident. So the larger unit, for a one-bedroom unit, it might be $60, but for the four-bedroom unit, it might be less, per resident that
Right.
they split it up.
And I forget if you showed how four-bedroom suites might be converted to smaller units. Did I see that in this presentation?
That was at the August 7th. That was at the previous hearing that they did have a slide showing how the four-bedroom units could be redistributed or rebroken down.
Okay, so I guess this is maybe for staff. Can cement panels under our current code be a primary material on a building like this?
In the commercial arterial, absolutely.
Again?
In the downtown, it varies based on district. There are a list of primaries that are allowed and then secondaries. So the answer just depends on the overlay. So with this PUD, as I mentioned, they've incorporated a lot of the design elements for downtown buildings because this is more of a taller building that is more in keeping with what you'll see in your downtown. So they incorporated the downtown standards for modulation, architecture. So with this, they are proposing to allow for cementitious panels to be a primary building material.
And you heard the report that they could last 30 years or so. Do you have any knowledge of how long a brick facade might last? Is it a 30-year expiration?
Based on my limited experience, I would say that brick would probably last longer than 30 years.
And the rationalization for these panels was to be, I forget the right word, contemporary maybe?
Yep, so certainly the cementitious panels give you greater flexibility in the look of them, the color of them, the design of them, the texture of them. That's certainly one of their advantages.
Would economics be one of the advantages?
I can't speak to that. I don't know the cost.
Maybe somebody could speak to the relative cost of more long-term material like a brick facade versus what seems to be kind of a short-term facade in the cement panels. And maybe a cost comparison too.
Yeah, I wanted to mention one thing first regarding the time frame that I gave you regarding the lifespan of a fiber cement panel. I don't have any empirical data based on test results. I can only estimate that it would be at least 30 years in terms of its longevity. It could actually be far greater than that. As someone that doesn't develop the materials, only specifies them, I can certainly look into it for you, and we can report that information back. As far as material selection, we're very careful as architects not to let budget be the sole determinant of the types of materials we're specifying for projects. So we choose materials for texture, for their ability to reflect light, their performance, in the aesthetics overall. In terms of installed cost, a fiber cement panel with a reveal system. Depending on the kind of material we're using, could start in the high $20 per square foot and work its way to well beyond $50 a square foot. Typically, brick, it varies based on the type of brick you're using, the composition of brick that you're using. We're certainly not using the most economical brick here. The brick that we're selecting is top drawer brick. It is almost $1 a brick, so almost $1,000 a square foot. So we try to reconcile materials just sort of based on what they can contribute to the overall composition of the project. The fiber cement material was not selected based on cost. We recommended it to the ownership based on what we felt like it could contribute to the overall composition of the facade. We haven't had conversations because we're still fairly early in the design process. As I mentioned to you before, we haven't done a detailed breakdown of what percentages of materials we're using. The owners trusted us to make recommendations for the materials we think make the most sense, and they have not objected to any of our recommendations thus far.
So if it's not an economic thing, maybe on longevity, that could be a possibility to make a more durable building.
As long as we could reconcile that with what that does for aesthetics, because brick is fairly traditional material, and brick is today not used as it's been for hundreds of years before. It's not a load-bearing material anymore. It today consists of basically a veneer that floats over the structure the same way as the fiber cement panel does. So the underlying structure, as practiced traditionally, is not a masonry, a multi-width sort of brick structure. It is still essentially a frame designed to resist a lot of movement and the structural loads that are imposed that we are asked to reconcile by building code. And then the brick is functionally just a veneer. It's in practical terms no different than a fiber cement material, a metal panel system. It's really just there for aesthetics, and that's how it's pretty much used consistently in modern architecture.
Mr. Sturley, we need to wrap this up.
I would just comment that in durability, it is a superior product.
It definitely is more durable in terms of being able to take impact, and that's why we're using it along the ground floor, for sure. No arguments there. Completely agree.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Chopra.
Yes, I have two additional questions. The first is about the setback, so I suppose I should ask the developer the question, why is the setback variance needed?
Which part, on the back or the front?
All of it, front and back.
The question was answered.
I don't think that it was answered, which is why I'm asking it.
I thought it, okay.
Can you specify which setback you're talking about? So,
All that are not within what our code provides. So I think there was a front and a back setback. Mr. Grulich might be able to remind us.
If I could.
State your name, please.
For the record, Steve Brehob with
Thank you.
Smith Brehob and Associates. We're not asking for a setback variance. We're asking for a PUD zoning designation. We're not asking to use the underlying CA zone. The questions that have been asked is, how does what is being proposed by the project compare to the setbacks of the underlying CA zone? But we're not saying we need a variance to those setbacks. What we're saying is we want to use these setbacks that we listed in the PUD zoning.
So, Mr. Grulich, I'm just going to rephrase what you said and ask if I'm understanding this correctly. Because of the way it would be zoned if the PUD were proposed, it would be within the city's parameters for building in that space. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, we said that one more time.
Yes.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
And I think I understand what you're saying. I just want to make sure. So because of it, they're asking for the PUD to be approved. If the PUD were approved, the setbacks that are proposed would be fine based on the PUD parameters. Is that correct?
Yes, so,
Okay.
so if this PUD was approved, this would be developed in accordance with the setbacks that the council is ultimately approving with the district ordinance that governs this property.
Okay, so to be clear, does the administration have any qualms about the setbacks that are being proposed?
So far, we have not been concerned with the setbacks. The adjacent properties, you know, a lot of them where there are buildings to the south, the building's been moved back. The setbacks that are being proposed with this are pretty much in keeping with what we are proposing for the new zoning code for the student-oriented housing of 15 feet. So the setbacks that are being proposed here are in line and in keeping with what we're moving forward with.
You said 15 feet, but what are they asking? What is this proposal asking for? I thought it
So
was
at the
22.
closest points, which I'll just kind of highlight here on the screen, so at the back east corner, they're at about 11 feet. As you move north, they accomplish 20 feet. At the back southeast corner, they're at about 15 feet, and it narrows down to about 13 feet. I think they're about 10 feet at this location, and then it increases to about 25 feet. So it varies a little bit along the properties, but for the most part, the setbacks are meant to balance out the massing of a building and, you know, the modulation that they are proposing, the recesses, all of that helps balance out any portions where the setback might be a little bit less.
Okay, thank you. And my second question is also for the developer, and it pertains to features that are not just not bad for our environment, which is being destroyed by the second, but that are actually good for our environment. I realize I wasn't here a couple weeks ago, and this was probably already discussed, but if the developer could just briefly tell me what you're doing in this building to protect our environment. Blank stares.
I'm sorry, could you rephrase that? What we're doing in the building to protect?
With this development, what are you doing as a developer to mitigate your carbon footprint?
Well, again, all of the features that we've listed that we're going to incorporate into the building help reduce the carbon footprint from an energy efficiency, a sustainability feature. All those things are contributing to reduce our carbon footprint.
Sure, so I'm just asking you to tell me what they are. I
Do you have that?
don't have,
No, go ahead. I'm sorry, I don't know the list off the top of my head.
oh, so like
I
nothing remarkable then, is that what you're saying?
I can speak to some of the sustainable features that will likely get designed into this project.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the building shell, of course, is designed to meet the Energy Conservation Code, which is a robust system for trying to limit the amount of energy that's lost through the external envelope of the project. So a heavier insulation, roughly R20 around the perimeter of the project. The roof insulation would probably exceed R38. It could be well beyond that. The vinyl windows should have thermal breaks and will limit the amount of solar heat gain because there's a lot of glazing on this project as well. In terms of like overall site design, what that does is it controls the amount of cooling and heating that's needed throughout the course of the year because less is lost through inefficiencies in the building's envelope. I mean, in terms of overall design, we look at things like, you know, balancing the amount of soil that's being moved around so we're not having to haul any dirt off or bring any dirt in. Some of that is unavoidable. But to the extent that we can limit the amount of, unnecessary site work, we control that. We try to, during construction, we try to control the amount of, the waste that is disposed off in landfills and try to recycle as much as possible. We work with the construction teams to monitor that and to be able to calculate and keep track of how much material is being recycled over the course of the project. Its construction. This project is going to have a flat roof system. More than likely, we will have a low albedo roof, so it's not going to be absorbing a lot of heat. It'll be a light-colored roof, so it doesn't contribute to heat gain and a heat island effect. The majority of the parking on this project is actually provided under shade. So again, reducing the amount of heat island effect and reducing the amount of pavement on the site for parking needs. Most of it is within structures. The mechanical systems that we're specifying for this project are usually, leading class. They are high SEER ratings. whatever either the code requires or the green program that the owner chooses to engage in is what we will pursue, not just for condensing units, but also for air handlers. We could employ higher performance filter systems for the unit HVAC systems and the common use HVAC systems. We try to employ LED lighting wherever possible, or energy efficient lighting wherever possible. We may be using it quite a bit on this project. Again, very early in design, so we need to figure out, where we would use occupancy sensors, where we can use light that is energy efficient. But all of those things have been more or less committed to in the NGBS program that the owner will use as a template to provide sustainable features on this project. The list really informs every aspect of design, and it would be difficult to cover everything soup to nuts. But I hope this gives you some idea of the kinds of sustainable features that are going into the project.
So I'm just going to get a little more specific.
Sure.
Solar panels?
I don't know if we've looked at photovoltaic panels for this
Any solar energy
project.
usage?
No, I don't think that we've
What about green
discussed.
roofs?
Green roofs are generally not a good idea on wood frame buildings. However, it's not something that we've discussed with the client. I mean, it can create some issues. I've seen a lot of articles about green roofs on wood frame buildings. Wood, of course, is a sustainable, construction material, but
What about composting for your residents?
that is, frankly, as an architect, I'm indifferent to composting plumbing fixtures. But it's a user preference, and again, we haven't engaged the owner on whether they feel the residents would enjoy using composting toilets.
So I will point out they are required to do recycling.
I knew that, that's why I didn't ask, yeah.
And I would also point out that these are fully furnished apartments. So for us, that is a significant thing when you look at the amount of couches and things that are thrown away every single year in beds. So that's a significant thing I would point out.
I guess I'm going to make this a question. What I don't understand is how we have local developers who are building much smaller projects, with much less density, who only develop within this area, are able to do the things that I mentioned and still turn a profit. That's my question. I don't understand how such a large entity who builds presumably across the nation can't do what local developers are doing. So you don't have to answer it today.
I'm not sure if there's an answer to that question, but.
It's
Okay.
a major concern.
Thank you for that. I need to call an end to questions here. Thank you for the responses. Can I get a show of hands? How many people are eager to speak to this project? Please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I'm going to limit everyone to 4 minutes each. And it's time now to come to the podium and state your name. We're also going to be limiting final comments from council members to the same amount or less. So please come to the podium, state your name. There will be a gong that warns you when your time is close to being up.
Hi, I'm Greg Alexander. I came at the meeting, 3 weeks ago for the same project to tell you guys that there's a sidewalk gap south of 19th Street on the east side of Walnut. And Mr. Volan was kind enough to suggest that that gap was going to be filled, and it isn't. It isn't going to be filled. It's not part of this project. It's not. I looked at the project material. I watched staff presentation. It's not. They are going to fill a gap on the north of 19th Street, but not south of 19th Street. So this is, it's about, 800 feet from the project. There is a sidewalk gap between the project and the city. And I think that's the sort of thing you guys really, really need to know. That's one of the reasons I'm telling you. And the other reason I'm telling you is that you didn't know. How could you not know this? I have kids. I work all the time. I have had time. I work a full-time job, and I'm a stay-at-home dad, and I had time to go out and inventory these sidewalks. And there isn't any sidewalk on 19th Street. There are sidewalk segments. This is what staff had to say about the sidewalk segments on 19th Street. This is a verbatim quote. There are various sidewalk segments along 19th Street that would then carry folks over to the Dunn Street area. How are you going to carry folks on sidewalk segments? Not any of these segments is longer than 200 feet. Not one segment is contiguous from one property line to the next property line. There are no sidewalks on 19th Street. There's a sidewalk gap on Walnut south of 19th Street, and I am flabbergasted that staff suggests a sidewalk segment could carry pedestrian traffic. Would staff suggest that a roadway segment could carry car traffic? Would this even be before you if Walnut was just a series of segments? And I can't explain how livid this makes me. You guys have hired staff, you guys have paid, you guys clearly trust staff on this issue. Staff has time to do the work, staff has done the work, and then they come to you and they tell you that we have a sidewalk system twice now for the Evolve project, the exact same thing. They bragged about the sidewalk network in this part of town. There are no sidewalks in this part of town. There are no contiguous sidewalks. Even today, a year after it's been open, the Evolve is missing key sidewalk segments to connect to anything except the bypass. The bypass, there's only contiguous sidewalks to the bypass. Nobody wants to walk to the bypass. There's no contiguous sidewalks going south towards campus. There's no contiguous sidewalks going east towards campus. How can we keep doing this? You guys need to know that we don't have a sidewalk network before you can fix it. And you guys need to know that. Staff should tell you. Thank you.
I'm timing it.
Hi,
4
my name's
minutes.
Lance Furr, and I'm with University Properties. We have like 490 units and like 1,150 beds. We've had that and spread out over like 35 acres, so we've operated that for like the last 15 years. But we don't object to the project per se. We think the density is way too high, and a 500% variance in the code or whatever we feel like it's too much, and for that area it's too many tenants. And so the other thing we have a problem with is the parking. Our experience is that we have like 0.9 spaces per bed, and all of our lots are full, and we're like right next to the stadium. All of our stuff is like, Stadium Crossing, Varsity Gate, Cedar Creek, and so our tenants still have cars, and so these guys are almost a mile away, and feel like you're not going to have enough parking, and it's going to cause a parking problem for not only us but the other apartment complexes. So yeah, that's basically what we said. And then I want to say I never used the word pay to play. I didn't mean to imply that either. I meant to say that, to be clear, I meant to say that I think the $2.5 million donation to the Low-Income Housing Fund, which is probably a very good thing for that fund and for the low-income housing, but I think it definitely has an effect upon the variance, the density variance, 500%, and the lower parking. That's what I meant to say, so thank you.
Gary Founds. I want to note first that I heard someone say that, well, this is a PUD, so these aren't technically variances. While that might be true, technically the PUD ordinance itself does require the council to look at what otherwise would be applicable to this property, and then there are criteria that the council has to consider in order to determine whether varying from those and granting the PUD is justified. So the setback variance remains an issue. It does, because it is still, in theory, a variance. And it was noted, too, that there's a buffer yard requirement here, and I think I was the one who pointed that out recently. The roughly 850 linear feet of the border requires a 22-foot setback if there were not a PUD granted. But also, along that 850 feet, there would be about 35 deciduous trees and 70 evergreen trees required. There are 0 in the plan. Now, I know someone said something about pay to play early on, and they took offense to that term, and I understand that, but that is perception in the community. It happened with Evolve. I heard it from a number of people, not clients necessarily even, acquaintances, and I heard it again. I was at the hospital recently for the birth of a child. Believe it or not, I'm talking to an anesthesiologist. He asks me what I do. I tell him my practice areas, and the very first thing he says, well, what about that North Walnut development? And this is nearly a direct quote. I guess You can build anything you want in Bloomington if you have enough money. Now, I understand how this works. I'm not naive. Nevertheless, that's perception. We have a problem, and we need to deal with that perception problem. It's also a problem because only about 3 years ago, one of my clients was threatened repeatedly with fines for density in a better location of 15 and a fraction units per acre. He wasn't offered the same opportunity to bend the rules with a donation. And I think if that's going to be the practice, then everyone, when they're threatened with a fine for violating density in that area, needs to be given the opportunity to pay. I'm not going to say pay to play, but pay for increased density, because that's the impression we're giving everyone with this approach. Now, there was a comment made about business model, long-term hold. This is a very young company. Their first project, according to their website, that's all I have to go off of, was 2015. That was one. They're already flipping that one. They built one in 2017 and 3 in 2018. So there really isn't a good past business practice to look at. So is Bloomington willing to hitch their wagon to that star and take a big risk on something like this? Because it is a big risk. If they can't fill the beds, I heard someone flippantly say, well, it's their problem. Well, it's not. It's our problem. It's your problem. It's my problem. It's the community's problem. If it doesn't work, it's our problem. And then
Yeah,
there's
one minute.
what, pardon?
1 minute.
Okay. There was something mentioned about evolve and nuisance calls. I've had, well, rhetorically, personal experience with that. These are essentially ungoverned, glorified dorms with interior entrances and heavy density inside a small space with lots of undergraduate students. It is a recipe for problems. Another reason why the density should be reduced, and reducing the density would also address some of the traffic concerns and cut-through concerns and safety concerns that haven't adequately been addressed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Joe Bergen, Director of City Relations for IU Student Government. I just want to thank all the parties involved for their thoughtful planning and consideration. I believe students will be excited about this project so long as it is affordable, so long that it is accessible by transit, by foot, by bicycle. And I wanted to speak to the affordability that was mentioned earlier. I live in a 5-bedroom house, and I wouldn't be able to live in a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment or house if that wasn't available to me. And I think that option is very important for students. And the unfortunate reality is that students will party anywhere. So as student government, we're going to encourage safety and respect to Bloomington residents and neighborhoods. But I want to echo that affordability is more important than what students do in their personal time. But I support this project. I support its affordability. And I want to thank all parties involved. I think students will support this project. I think it'll be a great place to live for students so long as it is accessible and so long as it is environmentally friendly. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further public comment? We have extra time. Seeing none, we'll come back to the council we actually have a few minutes for additional questions, but we only about 5 minutes. If not, we can go straight to comments. We'll go to comment. We'll start with Councilmember Chopra.
I think Sturbaum.
Councilmember Chopra defers to Councilmember Sturbaum. Councilmember. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I didn't take it back.
A question of who, Mr. Sturbaum?
Go ahead.
I guess it's one question of staff. We've now seen, this is the 3rd large student project that's come through. 2 of them have been turned down. I wonder if you'd contrast those 3 projects, compare and contrast a little bit.
Sure, I think that's very easy. Location. The location for those other 2, one was on the far west side of town off of 17th Street. The other was on the far east side of town off of 446. Certainly the one off of 446 was not directly marketing themselves as a student-oriented housing development, but both of those were very different locations. This is in an area that we want high density. There is
Right.
goods and services right by here. There's bus stop. The IU campus is just across the way. The location is entirely different here.
I'm not noticing on-site amenities for the residents? You know, both of these other projects had pools and recreation areas, and maybe I'm missing something.
Yeah, so this particular facility, and I think they spoke about this a little bit at the previous hearing, they've got an enormous amount of study rooms, areas on the inside of the building. You know, one of the things I'd certainly point out about this location is you've got a city park exactly across the street. It doesn't have a pool specifically, and maybe there's an indoor pool here, I can't honestly say. But they've certainly devoted a lot of the interior space with this building for amenities, and then certainly a city park right across the street.
Right, and do you have any concern with the parking question?
We are not concerned with parking, no. You know, certainly the last thing that we want to do is overpark. You know, what we found with student-oriented housing and what we're hearing with other developments is students bring their cars and they just sit. The cars sit in the parking lot and they don't really use them. So certainly underparking, or I'm sorry, more appropriately parking to match the need and the demand is a lot better planning principles and encourages alternative transportation. All of the things that our comprehensive plan encourages.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. We'll go now to debate from council members who would like to go first. Councilmember Piedmont Smith. I'm going to give you 4 minutes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for your efforts at improving this petition. I think it has improved since the last hearing. I appreciate the pulling it closer to the street and putting all the parking in the interior of the site. I think that's excellent. There is a perception of pay to play. I hear it. I think it's out there. I do not think that our planning department or its staff members are unethical in any way. I think they have high integrity, as does the mayor. But it's a perception that it's easy to see why people think that, because we have proposals that vary broadly from our current UDO that are getting approved that have this component of a donation to our Affordable Housing Fund. So, you know, I believe what I said at the last hearing was that the perception is reflects poorly on the city. Do our current rules mean nothing anymore? I know we're in a transition phase. I know we're having UDO hearings currently on the new UDO, but this project varies so drastically from what our current UDO says. I really am uncomfortable with it. Even compared to Evolve, which itself set a new record for density, you know, this is 77 units an acre. Evolve was 50, and what's currently allowed is 15. It also has more impervious surface than what would otherwise be allowed. The height is 85 feet. Dunhill was 72 feet, and what is currently allowed is 50 feet. So this is an extraordinary increase. I think that there are just insufficient guarantees that this will be, insufficient guarantees and insufficient just plans for this to be a sustainable building project. What we had in our packet initially on sustainability was one paragraph, and it was very vague. We heard a few more details this evening from the architect, but they can't even commit to a low albedo roof. That's rather minimal. There are not enough trees. There's not enough green space. As the Environmental Commission said, it should stick to at least a maximum of 60% impervious surface. It has 70%. And coming back around to the initial comments from the planning director, I do, of course, see the benefit of having $2.46 million go to affordable housing. Obviously, that is a benefit. But I don't like the way we're arriving at that. It bothers me that we have rules and that they're being thrown out the window in drastic ways, and that there's a perception that it's because of this $2.46 million. It bothers me, and I'm very glad we're almost to the point of having a new UDO where it'll be very clear what the incentives are and what can be expected as a rule and not as an individual negotiation.
That's your time.
That is my time, but I'm not happy with this proposal. Thank you.
Next, Councilmember Chopra.
There's a lot to like about this project. I think the density is appropriate for the location. I think the targeted population is also appropriate. I did a quick calculation on Google Maps, and it shows that it's a 10-minute walk to the stadium. That's great. I like that it's on public transit. I like that there's a component to affordable housing, and while I'm not completely comfortable with the aspect of paying into the fund, I do realize the reality of different housing types, so I'm willing to swallow that. What I'm not willing to swallow this evening, and the reason why I'll be voting or abstaining tonight with the no up or down recommendation, is the lack of concern for our environment in this building. I said it before as a question, and I'll state it now by noting that we have local developers, people who live in our community, who are not building as dense, not building as large, and yet seem to come up with the funds to provide community gardens and gardening plots and green roofs, composting, rain barrels. And it's hard for me to believe that it's solar panels, they use solar panels, that these things couldn't be done by a company who's willing to pay out that much into the Affordable Housing Fund. I mean, clearly even giving that much and you're still making a profit over so many years, I just don't buy it. So either, in my opinion, that either needs to change or it's going to be a no vote for me at the time that this hits council. Because surely we can find a developer who's excited to build the exact same building with the same density and everything, and yet also do it in a much more environmentally friendly manner. So I would be surprised if it could change, but I'd be delighted if it did. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Chopra. Councilmember Sturbaum.
Yeah. I would consider supporting if this was a floor shorter and was a contemporary modern building with traditional materials that have durability over time. My personal opinion is cement panels are the new EIFS. They're less expensive. They're not built for the long term. This building should have a life cycle and a lifespan after the students find it to be not the coolest place to live anymore, and I see it as a deteriorating structure at that point because of the quality of the exterior. And if the cost isn't a factor, I challenge the architect to be creative with traditional materials and show us something that looks like it's going to be there even for preservationists in the future. You know, I look long-term because I protect buildings that are 100 years old now, and they become valuable parts of the community. But if it's just to come in and strip mine and go, I can't think that that has a real benefit to the community. So I want to be convinced that this is a durable building that will be loved and cared for and a positive contributor to our community. So I'm going to pass, but that's my advice. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Sturbaum. My turn. I was adamantly against Evolve for many of the reasons that were mentioned today. This is an even bigger project. It's farther away, and yet it does a lot better than Evolve did. There are many features of it that improve on what Evolve did. In particular, the parking ratio, I would cap it at 0.5, but still, that's a possibility at all is a compliment. The true innovation of actually funding a bus route instead of their own shuttle, being willing to, that's still a very big thing for me. But I mean, I think the talk about pay to play really misses the point. It's a more subtle point. It's not that that's happening. It's that so many people in this room and who think about projects like this do not seem to realize that this is the willful separation of students from the rest of the city. I deplore the student housing zoning idea, and I'm going to be fighting against it in the UDO, looking to remove it. Dorms treat students like children, and that is not what we want for our city, in my opinion. This project is 1.7 miles from the Wells Library. It's an equal 1.7 miles from the law school. And yet it's effectively an extension of the campus. The only upside to that is that at least it's not IU building the dorm, that we can actually have some control as a city over the management of this property. And yet we're ready to cede most of it to a project that greatly exceeds what is called for by our UDO. I'll reiterate Councilor Piedmont-Smith's question again. Why do we have rules? We're just going to allow exceptions to them every time, let alone ones this big. I mean, a PUD is like variances cubed or factorial, just adding a ton of variances all in one project. But if you don't want students to party, you don't build 4 and 5 bedroom units. Now, Mr. Bergen pointed out that that also makes them affordable, but how much are we going to be spending in policing a project like this? How much do we spend in Smallwood or the other large projects like this? There's got to be a better way, a less intensive way. But having said that, I think that what I've heard tonight are, in my opinion, there needs to be no more than 0.5 parking spaces per bedroom to even think about approving this. I would allow them to put projecting signs to make the commercial more visible. If we're going to be making exceptions to code, we should do that too, and I'd like to see projecting signs put back into the UDO. We actually have to have a requirement for funding of the new route. We can't just say they will. We need to know how much it's going to be. That's going to be an important part of the council's final decision. I think the developers are going to need to better answer Mr. Serbaum's question about the sustainability of the exterior cladding and cementitious panels. They're going to need to better answer Councilor Chopra's question about environmentalism, the solar panels, green roof, composting, or like features. And I think they're going to have to answer Mr. Alexander's question about sidewalks. It was my understanding that they were going to actually build sidewalks on 19th Street. I may have misread the project, not only sidewalks on Walnut Street. But I think that is going to play a key role if this project is so connected to IU. Let's see as explicit a description of that as we will of the eventual new bus. That concludes my comments, and at this point now I'm looking for a recommendation.
Recommend to pass.
Need a second.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Does the clerk call the roll on this, or do we? Okay, then I will ask for a vote, starting on my left.
Could you explain what our vote is?
Our vote is a recommendation to the full council. There have been no reasonable conditions proposed tonight. We are clearly leaving that to the full council. We are simply recommending what we think the council should do with this project at this point.
Are we recommending to forward it to council with or without recommendation?
No matter what we vote, it will go to the council. We may vote a negative recommendation, it will still go to council.
Okay, so this is the last meeting.
This is the,
Goes to council
unless
after
we,
this.
yes, that's right.
Our vote will reflect our level of support of this project?
Correct, as it has been presented to us up to now.
Okay.
The project may change by the time it comes to council. The full council may request more changes.
Okay, I will pass.
Mr. Servon passes.
No.
No from Councilmember Piedmont Smith. I will pass.
I will pass as well.
The final vote is 0-1-3, and that will be forwarded to the full council at the meeting of September 4th, and the council will decide what to do at that point. I want to thank everyone for their attendance and for their patience through this process. After I will comment, this comment ends, I will adjourn the meeting. This will be followed by a regular meeting of council at 7:30. Thank you. This meeting is adjourned.
Special session.
Special session. This meeting is adjourned.